Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Design Beyond Pixels. This is a series of podcasts that will allow design leaders across the US and Europe to discuss topics completely chosen by them. Today, I'm joined by Bob Baxley. Bob, thanks so much for joining me today. Can you please just give us a very short introduction into yourself?
Sure. Well, first of all, Matt, thanks for having me. It's great to be with you today. Yeah, as you know, just mentioned, my name is Bob Baxley. I live in Silicon Valley. I've been a professional UI designer since 1990. So one of the first people in the industry, moved here to Silicon Valley to work for a company called Claris, which was a wholly owned software subsidiary of Apple. Was there for a number of years, and in the 3 decades that have passed, some time at Claris, a long stint at Apple, leading the design team for the Apple Online Store and doing some of the software they use in retail. Also led a team at Yahoo that launched Yahoo Answers, served as the head of design at Pinterest briefly, and currently I am the senior vice president of design and experience at a data analytics startup called ThoughtSpot.
Thanks very much for the intro, Bob. Um, Now, this podcast is going to be slightly different to many, as you may have seen, as I'm giving my guests full ownership of what we're going to be discussing during these episodes. Now, Bob, I gave you the task of picking some topics prior to us jumping on here. So can you just quickly give the guests an overview of some of the stuff that we'll be running through today?
Yeah, first of all, I have to say this is a genius technique by you, Matt, and one that all the managers on the call are going to appreciate because it seems like you're giving me a lot of freedom, but what you're actually doing is you're delegating. So it's so nice job by you.
Don't know what you're talking about. Don't know what you're talking about.
So the three bullet points that I mentioned to you that I thought would be interesting is sort of what I've learned about AI working at ThoughtSpot. We have a major AI initiative going on, and we've been working hard on that stuff for about the last 12, 18 months. So there's been some interesting learnings that I've had there, which I've gotten to talk about in some other forums as well. That'll, I think, naturally lead into some discussions about where design's going in the next few years and kind of where we've been. We're definitely feels like design's definitely an inflection point. You don't have to spend too much time on LinkedIn realizing people feel that they're at a crossroads. So that'll be interesting. And then I do always like to come back to why is it that someone like me is still in this 3 decades on? Like, what kind of keeps people going? And I have some slightly different ways of thinking about software and what it means to us as a culture that'll probably be a nice thing to close with.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think some of the topics will be super relevant to the industry itself right now. I completely agree. I think design is in a transition period. Podcast I ran before was probably during a different transition that we probably didn't expect to happen this quickly. But it was during a very big time for design just after COVID when everyone seemed to want design to or hire designers into their business. But obviously it's a little bit of a different situation now, which of course we'll delve a little bit more into. But yeah, obviously another super relevant topic right now is AI. I think everyone is talking about it. There seems to be a new startup in the AI space pretty much every day that's getting billion-dollar valuations, or at least a couple of $100 million valuations with very little proof of concept or an actual product that's out there just yet. um, but yeah, no, I think obviously you've been at ThoughtSpot. How long have you been at ThoughtSpot now for?
About 4.5 years now.
Cool.
Yeah, so started just before the pandemic.
Yeah. So give us just a quick overview of obviously ThoughtSpot, who they are, and then yeah, we can obviously delve a little bit deeper into what you've learned over those 4.5 years whilst being there.
Yeah, so ThoughtSpot's a data analytics company. We compete with the likes of Tableau, Microsoft Power BI, products like that. I think in the space, we're uniquely targeted at business users. So that's why design at ThoughtSpot is so important, and it's what made me want to go there. The products I just mentioned, and many of our competitors actually target professionally trained data analysts and data scientists. We're trying to create a professional grade data analytics tool, just basically a tool for creating charts and graphs and being able to navigate through complex data sets. Um, so you have to imagine a data set like at Walmart, for example, where you might have
Yeah,
two
of course.
billion transactions that you're trying to look through, right?
Yeah.
So what kind of tool do you use to do that? And again, our tool, because we're trying to target business users, there's a level of usability and approachability and sophistication of design that our business model requires that our competitors don't necessarily share. So that's largely the heart of the company. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously you've worked at some rather large organizations. I know ThoughtSpot is a startup, as you mentioned. What stage is ThoughtSpot at
Yeah,
the
it's a
moment?
pretty, even when I joined, it's a pretty advanced startup. So it was a
Yeah,
Series E. Yeah, it was a Series E when I joined. I think the company was about 500 employees at the time, valued at
sure.
a couple of $1 billion. So already a
Yeah,
unicorn. I'm not at this stage of my career. I'm not really a seed round or Series A or B type person.
yeah,
The stuff that I can do as a design leader doesn't really start happening in a company until you get to maybe Series D or E. It has to be a
sure.
little bit more mature.
Yeah,
And the company currently, we did get another round of funding kind of towards the beginning of the pandemic. So on Series F, in our last round, we were valued at a little bit over 4 billion, I believe. So yeah, and it's 1,000 people now worldwide.
yeah,
So it's not, it's not some little fly-by-night
yeah,
operation. The
yeah.
majority of our R&D teams located in India, multiple locations across India. And although my design team remains kind of a small but mighty group, we have people here in Silicon Valley, as well as some folks on the East Coast of the United States. And then the bulk of our teams spread out across India, largely in Bangalore.
Cool. So yeah, look, I know obviously you wanted to cover off the topic, what you've really learned about AI at ThoughtSpot. Give me an understanding of where your knowledge was prior to joining there. I'd love to know a little bit more in terms of, what you'd worked on before joining there, and obviously where, the advancements in your knowledge and what you've really learned after joining them now.
Let me just push on that a little bit. So we're going back to 2019, before the pandemic, if you can remember that. That's when I joined ThoughtSpot.
Yeah,
Their business was a very different kind of thing than the company was an on-premises software only. It's now a
sure.
SaaS-based product, et cetera. So ThoughtSpot itself has transitioned tremendously and evolved significantly in the 4 years I've been there. Do you want to talk about sort of what I learned pre 2019?
Yeah, look, it'd be great just to obviously get a little bit of a core understanding. We don't have to go too much into detail into that because I know you want to talk mainly about the thoughts on how that's sort of advanced. But yeah, it'd be great to know obviously a little bit more about your understanding of it, where it was probably at in 2019 before you joined as well.
Yeah, so again with the company, I had taken quite a long career break. I'd left Pinterest and I'd spent a few years basically networking, talking to other design leaders, doing some moderating of design meetings for Envision and other companies. And then there was sort of a point where I was like, I decided it was time to go back to work, and we should come back to this point at the end of the conversation because I'll
Sure.
tell you how I got rejuvenated because there was
Yeah.
definitely a period where I
Yeah,
became
definitely.
very disillusioned with tech. And I decided it was time to go back into work. And I contacted one of my friends who's a talent partner at a venture capital firm here in Silicon Valley. She introduced me to the founder of the company, Jeet Singh. I met with Ajit, then I met with the CEO of the company, Sadish Nair, and I really liked both of them. I just liked them personally. I felt
Yeah.
that that they had a very unusual and powerful balance of humility and confidence. In Silicon Valley, it's easy to find confidence. It's not easy to find humility, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, for sure.
And it's hard to work as a creative in environments where leadership is just certain all the time because they don't, if leadership is certain all the time, they don't really deal too well with the ambiguity and the uncertainty of the design process. And so finding a leader that can straddle both the worlds, have humility to know, well, maybe this will work, maybe it won't, but then also the confidence to know that when it gets close enough, they can make the call and we can move forward. That's just a tough balance to find.
Yeah.
And both with Sadish and Ajit, they just also struck me as wonderful, wonderful human beings that I could trust and wanted to
Yeah.
be around. And so, to be honest, that was the main thing that brought me to the company.
Yeah.
And if I look back across my career, more often than not, I was drawn to who the leader was I was going to work with, more so than the business or even the product. So that was what took me and what got me into ThoughtSpot. Obviously, they needed design, as I mentioned. It was core to the business model and core to the vision and mission of the product. So when I started, I inherited a team of about 24 folks, and we kind of took off from there. And it's been a long journey, like trying to bring Apple quality design or even that sort of level of thinking into a company that's an enterprise software company that's largely about creating features so that you can compete with other so you can get into the buying cycle
Yeah.
with other checklists or other sets of features. That's a tough challenge. We are, I think, to this day regarded as the best user experience in the data analytics space. We're sort of flattered but also a little miffed that our competitors are now blatantly stealing a lot of our UI. They're
What
ripping.
usually happens, right?
Yeah, so I mean, you can take it as a sign of success, but you get
Yeah.
frustrated they're not coming up with their own ideas.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah, and I mean, yeah, I've learned a ton during the 4 years about
Yeah,
all sorts of things that we could talk about, including what it's like to try to lead a team that's on the other side of the world,
yeah,
but also a lot of things about leadership and influence and stuff
yeah.
like that. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, let's go into that. Obviously, you said a large portion of your design team sounds like a large portion of other teams as well are based in India, obviously the other side of the world. I think there's been that. I think ever since COVID, obviously that the remote working possibility has obviously become a lot more available to many people. To the extent of the other side of the world, perhaps it's still rare. But yeah, how have you navigated that? How have you found that? And what have you really learned from that side of leadership and the process of trying to manage people in such different time zones?
Yeah, well, it took us a long time to figure it out, like multiple years, frankly, to try to figure out how
Yeah,
to do this. For a long time, we tried to have like a weekly creative review with the entire team. But, India is, depending on the time of the year, from the point of view of California, Bangalore is 12 and a half hours ahead of us. Or when we switch to daylight savings time, they're 13 and a half hours ahead of us,
yeah, wow,
which means that if I'm meeting them at 8 a.m. my time, which I can kind of get up and get rallied and get to my, home office by
yeah,
8 a.m. But, if I'm
yeah,
on at 8 a.m., it's already, at least 8:30, if not 9:30 p.m. for them. Now, in Bangalore, they are used to working a little bit later. That's just sort of the reality of living and
yeah,
working in tech in Bangalore. But still, somebody is at not a great part of their day.
yeah,
And so I learned pretty early on that we needed to figure out how to minimize the face-to-face meetings and kind of bring it down to like maybe just one night a week so people could have time
yeah,
to focus other than that. So just try to be very diligent about when do you use a meeting and to think of a meeting as a tool of communication, not as your default mode.
yeah,
And there's all these different ways to communicate with Figma and with Slack and with Miro and with Loom and all this other stuff. So what's in the a meeting is just one more of those tools. So you have to think about when do you actually need the meeting. Like that was a huge learning. And then one of the things we've really been really leaned into in the last year and a half is using Loom, which is a
yeah. Mhm.
video tool.
Yeah, we use it in
Right. So
recruitment as well.
yeah, so we do a couple of things with Loom. One is instead of the designers sending me Figma files for me to look at, and I think every design leader knows that looking at somebody else's Figma files, like, like digging through their bathroom cabinets or something, like it's
Yeah,
just, you
yeah.
do not want to go into somebody
What
else's
am I going to
Figma
discover
file.
here?
Yeah, and it's and the designers kind of understandably they don't set up their files in a way that they can be consumed by others because it's not where their
Yeah,
head's at, which is frankly a big miss because they don't realize how many people come into those files. It's, salespeople, engineers, all sorts of
yeah,
folks, for better or for worse,
yeah,
they're digging
yeah,
around your Figma files trying to figure out what's going on. And so anyways, instead of the designers sending me Figma files, what they more often do is send me a Loom video where they're walking through the work and kind of explaining it to me as they would do in a
yeah.
face-to-face creative review.
Mm.
Now, the huge benefit for them is that I can't interrupt them because it's a Loom video, and
Yeah,
so
true,
and
true. Yeah,
and if we were in person, I would interrupt them like every 15 seconds and we'd be
yeah,
doing all these different tangents. So instead, they send me the video and then I just put all my tangents in as comments, and then they have a chance to sit with it, and ruminate on it, play
yeah,
things back, kind of digest it in a different way. And so it kind of also changes the emotional dynamic. Because one of the things that again, for better or for worse, at Apple, there's not people aren't kind of dancing around about the feedback at a place like Apple. It's pretty, this is
yeah,
kind of how it rolls.
yeah,
And you're not, it's not about being a jerk or being mean to people. It's certainly not about, insulting them and not showing
yeah. Of
respect. But
course.
we're playing for keeps and the
Yeah,
conversation is about the work and you need to be able to like take the feedback in a really
yeah,
clear and concise and direct way, and that
mm,
can be challenging for people, especially if they're not used to it. So the
yeah,
Loom video thing for feedback has been really useful. And then one of my other leaders, a gentleman named Kaushik Panchal, who I've worked with, this is my third job. Kaushik and I have worked together. He's in New York, and one of the things we talked about was we weren't really, it was hard to understand what people were doing day in and day out. And we weren't quite sure where everybody's time was going. And it wasn't really an accountability thing. It was just, gosh, we have a really small team and are we really getting the throughput we need?
yeah,
And so we discussed doing a daily stand up. But again, the reality is we're on different sides of the world. And if you try to get people together every day, it just doesn't really work.
yeah, yeah,
So then Koshik suggested the idea that we do asynchronous stand-ups through Loom. And so now for over a year now, I think pushing 2 years, everyone on the team makes about a 1 to 2 minute video at the end of their day in Loom, sort of describing what they did that day and what's coming
Yeah.
up next.
Yeah.
And what's been really fascinating for that, and I'm just going to elaborate on this a little bit because I think it's a really useful management technique, which some of your listeners will really enjoy, which is, the benefit of doing these things is that the designers have to get really comfortable making these videos. So they have to get comfortable presenting, which almost everybody
Yeah.
in design wants to get better at presenting. So by having to make these videos every day, they're just getting in the
Yeah.
repetitions of being accustomed to doing this stuff. So when we have to make other videos to show to the board of directors or to show to new
Yeah.
recruits or to put on the website, like, they might get a little nervous because they have to make a new video,
Yeah.
but it's like, look, you've made
Yeah.
100
Yeah.
videos in the last couple of
Yeah.
years. Like, just make the new video.
Yeah.
So it's been really good for the team because they get in this practice of having to kind of present all the time. And then it's been great for us as a leadership team because we get to see everybody every day, and you kind of get a sense for how they're doing. And a big part of being I think being an effective design leader is understanding the emotional state of all your different designers, because creativity is what we
Yeah.
do is a very emotionally complicated thing. And if you don't have a good read on how people are doing, I think it's hard to understand how much pressure you can put on them and what you can expect from them at any given moment. And so just being able to kind of keep a sense of how people are doing has been really useful. And then sort of a really fun part is when people, go to their parents' house for the holidays or something like that, they'll make their videos in different places, sometimes
Yeah.
walking around the street doing their kind of daily life. And so it's
Yeah.
also been nice for the team because we get a little bit of insight into what people's daily environments look like. And it's not just these Zoom backgrounds all the
Mm.
time.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think it's a really interesting point. I've actually heard quite a lot recently, speaking to a couple of design leaders and just leaders in general about using Loom or similar video platforms to do that type of thing, end of day feedback, or if you want to very quickly run through something in a live situation, but you want to kind of take the emotion out of it. You want to take the back and forth, the potentially going off topic and things like that. You just want to get your sort of say out. It's a really, really useful tool. And yeah, as you said, it's also a learning process for designers, whoever uses it, to get comfortable in that type of situation, to get comfortable presenting. It's effectively a form of public speaking as well. It's that
Mhm.
uncomfortable situation that you put yourself into. I think the more and more, I think that type of scenario where it's quite a relaxed video that they're making will actually highly improve their ability to do it, because everyone knows that everyone, the best people on camera, actors, whoever it is, the more natural that they are, the better they are in that type of thing.
I think let me just push on that point for a
Yeah,
second,
sure.
because I think that's one of the things that people haven't really gotten their head around is
Yeah.
that we are all on TV now. Like
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that is the reality. We are all in these little
Yeah.
squares, and whether you want to be or not, you are all a TV personality now.
Yeah.
And so, people often comment on my mic or something like, whatever your setup might be. And
Yeah.
these things are not that expensive. Like,
Yeah.
really, folks, it's $100 for the mic. I know it looks impressive, but it's not that big
Yeah.
a deal. Um,
It's
and
better than my headset.
and thinking about how you present and like what's in the background and how you lean
Yeah.
in and are you recording yourself and just trying to get your performance
Yeah.
better. And it's not something people want to think about, but like it's become a very important skill
Yeah.
for modern design leaders. And actually, it's like really opened up, I think, a lot of opportunity. I have a friend who's 6'2", and I was talking to him during the pandemic, and he's like, "Yeah, this remote work, I've lost my biggest advantage because I was always
Yeah.
the tallest guy in the room.
Yeah.
And so when I walk in, I have a certain amount of power, but which is just the reality of our society,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah. It's true.
As someone who's 5'7",
Yeah.
much unfortunately,
Yeah.
And so you have to, how is it now that you're able to project
Yeah.
and get people's attention, and you have to be
Yes.
able to do it through some sort of on-screen presence,
Mm.
which again is not that difficult to develop if you just consciously decide
Yeah.
that's something you're going to do.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I
so
think it's just breaking those comfort zones or comfort barriers, isn't it? Really, like when I first did the podcast back in, I think it was 2022 when I first started doing it, I was like, this is never something I'm going to do. I can't do it. It's like I was getting so anxious and nervous about doing it. But it's just like, realistically, I want to do it because I want to try and build a bit more of a community. I want to reach out to people. Honestly, the first time I did a podcast, I didn't track anything in terms of like who was viewing it, who, I didn't care about that stuff. I just wanted to do it, break out of a comfort zone a little bit and just try it. And yeah, you do develop so much better, so much better skills that you probably would never have even thought about developing if if you never just threw yourself into it. So yeah, I
Yeah,
think
there's
it's
something about the performance. I
yeah,
remember early in my life when I was playing in cover bands and stuff and doing music,
yeah,
like, the amount of focus and attention you bring when you're on stage
yeah,
is how you get better. Like we could sit in the basement and practice for
yeah,
months and months and months and we'd get a little
yeah,
bit better.
yeah,
You put us
yeah,
on stage every
yeah,
night for a week and we
yeah,
it's just transformational.
yeah,
And you and I were talking about professional sports before we started
yeah,
recording, and I also kind of look at that. It's not like when we look at an NBA player trying to take free throws to win the game, at the end, you can look at it, you go, God, how did they not get intimidated by the crowd? And you're like, well, it's not the first time they've done
yeah,
this free
yeah,
throws in front
yeah,
of a crowd, right?
yeah,
You kind of
yeah,
work up to it. And,
yeah,
and so when I talk to people about public speaking and they're trying to figure out how to get better at it, I'm always like, well, you have to start with a small audience,
yeah, yeah.
and you have
Just
to
get used to
practice
it.
your
Yeah,
material and get
yeah,
comfortable with it. And then
yeah,
you kind of work up. Like if your first talk is going on stage in front of
yeah.
the board of directors of the whole company,
Thousands of people. Yeah,
yeah, you're gonna flip out.
yeah,
But if you can do these smaller things, and
yeah,
I'll put in one other quick plug since
yeah,
this is other design leaders, is I spend some time, not a ton of time, but a fair bit of time on ADP list, which I think probably
yeah,
most of your listeners know. So what's been really useful for me about ADP list is not only obviously the great opportunity to help younger designers and connect with people, but I also use ADP list as a way to try out my material. So
yeah,
I sort of think ADP list like a late night comedy club where I can go and I can try out different ways of telling
yeah,
my stories. And if they bomb, I can just tune it over time.
yeah,
So when I'm doing podcasts or when I have the chance to be on stage and I'm doing Q&A, there are the same questions. People are always going to ask me the same things. What was it like to present to
yeah,
Steve Jobs? What took you to
yeah,
ThoughtSpot? Blah, blah, blah. And I actually had the chance to practice all those questions through ADP List. So I'd encourage people to go on ADP List, not
yeah,
only because it's a great thing to do and it's really
yeah,
gonna, it benefit you and the other person,
yeah,
but you can also consciously use it as a way to kind of hone your little personal stories.
yeah,
So when you have the chance to share them, you've got them tight and you know when people are gonna laugh and you
yeah,
know when that punchline's gonna land.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you pick up on cues, don't you? It's about the repetition. It's about anything you do. Repetition always you start to pick up on things that work, things that don't quite work. And as you said, material within coaching, mentoring is the same thing. But yeah, so just going back to the AI side of it, Bob. I know we went a little bit off tangent there, but it's all part of a podcast, right? Because we can steer right back to where we wanted to get to. But yeah, just going back to the AI side. So obviously you joined ThoughtSpot 4.5 years ago. Um, I know you took a little career break before that. What has been the real advancements for you personally in your understanding of AI and how it can be utilized within a professional environment or professional products line, let's say.
Yeah, so I've only gotten into it in the last probably 9, 12 months. Like we
Yeah,
we started with a major AI initiative a little over a year ago. And again, ThoughtSpot's whole value prop is that business users, just what I call mere mortals, can
yeah,
go in and write queries against these big complex data sets, which are often against complicated databases that have hundreds of different columns, and those columns often have very cryptic names.
yeah,
And so even in our original tool where you could do kind of a light you could just type the column names and be able to create a query and get results without having to follow all the structure that you need for SQL or other languages like that. um, Users still needed to know what the column names were for their particular data set, which is a bridge too far for most business users. So what we've been able to do with AI is they're able to put in a natural language query. We're able to pass that to some intermediary technology we have that turns it into some column names, and then that goes off to the database and brings
yeah,
back the results for you. Um, so, AI for us, the natural language part of AI is actually helping us finally fulfill our true mission of being able to allow mere mortals to ask questions about these very complex data sets. And many other companies have spotted this opportunity as well. They don't have 12 years in data analytics and understanding all the back end stuff that has to happen to actually make this stuff work. So a
yeah,
lot of those solutions are pretty surface level and they make good demos, but they don't actually work in real life. And I think that's probably part of one of my big learnings is that a lot of the AI stuff right now, it looks kind of good and it's kind of fun and it's kind of cool. But then when you really start pushing it and you're trying to make it really perform for you, not as much. So I
Yeah.
suspect a lot of these ideas are gonna, or a lot of these companies are gonna fall away pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Again, is this intermediary, or is this technology that allows you to take somebody with a minimal amount of training and or minimal amount of knowledge and get them into the mainstream? I think that's where AI is really going to help in the near term. And I think a lot of
Yeah.
folks understand that if you're already an expert, AI might not help you that much. But if you're
Yeah.
not an expert, AI can definitely get you into the middle pack pretty quickly. I
Yeah.
think folks understand that. The other piece that I was a little surprised by, and one of our PMs at ThoughtSpot's really been pushing this pretty hard, and to his credit, a lot of AI is about training the AI.
Yeah. It is. Yeah. Yeah.
Especially when you're talking about these small, these smaller models for like a company's data
Yeah.
set or something. So my mental model of AI is that it's like the world's fastest college intern.
Yeah.
And, and which is cool. It's just, but you wouldn't expect to just give a college intern a problem and then just come back and nail it and you not have to give them any feedback. Like
Yeah.
working with a college intern is like, it takes a
Yeah. Of
lot,
course. Yeah.
with all due respect to college interns. So it's just, there's a lot of feedback loop and you have to train
Yeah.
them and and that's just part of the deal. And I'm not
Yeah.
sure when people start using AI and they're looking at these different AI applications inside their companies, if they're really thinking about what that feedback
Yeah.
experience looks like and how do I train the AI so I don't have to
Yeah.
keep repeating the lessons over and over and over
Yeah.
again.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the concepts or ideas are very exciting in the industry right now, as to what it could potentially do. But as you said, we've just we personally we've just transferred onto a new recruitment CRM system that's quite quite heavily powered by AI. But we
Mhm,
literally did the training session today, and you know we exactly what you said. Everything that we put into it ultimately is going to help train it do a better job in the future. But without that feedback, it would just be keep giving us the same results. And
mhm,
as you
mhm,
said, I think there's some great ideas and a lot of concepts floating about within AI at the minute. But how much do they understand? The time that it will take to actually develop something incredible that's really going to help function for the user base that they're operating on. Obviously, looking into the future, I know we wanted to discuss the next 3 5 years potentially in design, what it looks like. I know you discussed and mentioned that it feels like a little bit of a transition period for design in total. As I mentioned at the start, I think design definitely went through its own transition just sort of post COVID, right? I think everyone would agree that there was a big boom. Everyone seemed to wanted to hire design. I think design was probably one of the biggest functions within business, within digital products that really did grow and start to expand during that time. So where do you see, obviously, with the introduction of AI and looking into the next 3 5 years, where do you really see design going?
Well, I think what's happened with design in the last, whatever we want to call it, last 24
Yeah.
months is not necessarily an AI driven dynamic. I
Yeah.
think there was a lot of companies that looked at Apple and said, "Hey, I'd like to have me some of that." Um,
Yeah,
and
for
so a
sure.
lot of companies, a lot of CEOs and various technology leaders thought, "Hey, I'll just go hire some designers and suddenly everything will be better."
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
having worked inside Apple, I'm acutely aware of the fact that the entire corporate culture of Apple is organized around the concept of design. Like
Yeah.
like everybody in that company, from the receptionist through to the CEO, are constantly asking, "How can this be better?" They like you don't talk about design thinking at Apple because that's
No.
just how Apple
Yeah, it's
thinks.
just how it is. Yeah.
Like it's
Yeah.
just how it is. And so I, plenty of companies and gazillions of them around me, they just thought if I go hire some graphic designers, suddenly everything's going to get better. And then it
Yeah.
didn't really turn out that way,
No.
which is not the fault of the designers. Like,
No.
they wanted to keep doing business the way they were doing business. And they thought the design was just going to be this little tip of the iceberg thing because they saw design as just this patina of
Yeah.
visual stuff at the end. And it's not. Design's like a whole mentality that has to
Yeah.
soak into every nook and cranny of the company. And that's what I've been trying to achieve at ThoughtSpot, frankly, with somewhat mixed results, which is understandable. But I think what happened is the many tech companies hired a ton of designers and they sort of looked around like, well, this isn't really moving the needle for us.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that's an easy thing for us to take out. And so, uh, I in some ways I might say that all the hiring of design of the last, whatever we might call it, the last 5 years was a bit of a mirage. Like
Mhm.
it was as somebody who's been doing design since 1990, and there was definitely decades in there where most companies didn't care at all about design. And then after the advent of the App Store, really, which is in 2008, that's when companies started saying, "Oh, this design stuff might actually matter."
Yeah,
And so from
yeah,
like 2010 until, 2010 to like whatever, 2018 or something, there's a lot of people trying to build stuff up. But I sort of, there was a period when I thought like we need a lot more designers, and I gave some talks about that. I was very passionate. We need more young people coming into design because I just felt like we didn't have the numbers that we needed. We were just so outmanned, so to speak, by engineering. And I think that was true for a while. But then there was like this massive overhiring. It was super easy to get a design job without
yeah,
much experience, without many qualifications. And then again, companies looked around and said, "Well, this isn't really. We're not getting much value
yeah,
here." And so I haven't been surprised that we're now facing these layoffs. I wouldn't quite call it a backlash as much as kind of a reversion to reality.
yeah,
Um, so that's part of your question. And the other part of your question is how AI is going to affect it. And before we got on the call, I was working on a little post for LinkedIn about this very topic. And my theory right now is that when you look at any creative act, and I think it's true for any creative act, but if we just limit it for a second just to design,
yeah,
when I really think about the design process, there's the double diamond, there's all these different processes, but they all kind of come down to the same thing, which is you have a period where you're exploring a bunch of stuff, and then you have a period where you're identifying the two or three most interesting ideas you want to pursue, and then you have a period where you're perfecting those things and like really honing in on one. And so we might call it exploration, evaluation, and execution. And when I think about the pieces that are most time intensive and that you would typically have less experienced people doing, it's the exploration stuff and the execution
yeah,
stuff. So the exploration is go find me 25 examples of a share dialog box, or, we need to go find an icon for X, go find a bunch of
yeah,
references there, just generate a bunch of ideas. And so
yeah,
people do that. And then at the end, and then somebody, a creative director, looks at all of them and says, no, that one's promising. Let's do more of that. And then you move to this execution phase where now they're running all the permutations. Um, and it feels to me like AI is going to do a pretty good job at that first thing and that
yeah,
last thing,
yeah,
but probably not as much at the evaluation thing in the middle. Um, and so I do sort of wonder if that reduces the need for the more labor intensive parts of design, which are typically done by people breaking into the industry, because they don't require the same level of experience. And so I worry that the demand for inbound for young designers is going to come down dramatically. And then
yeah,
I also, frankly, am worried that if you're not doing those two activities, how do you ever develop the taste and the experience to be able to be a good creative director? And so I kind of wonder, if you're not having to do the 47 versions of the icon, how do you ever develop the taste to know which one is good?
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah,
and frankly, I just don't know. And I'll say that about AI too.
yeah,
Like, um, if you read much about AI, it's absolutely clear nobody has any idea where it's leading. And there's also clear that everybody's making predictions nonetheless.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
then
definitely, definitely.
and then I had this joke. I have this joke I called Baxley's paradox of AI, which is whoever's predicting the future of AI always predicts a future where their job is going to be okay.
It's so true. Yeah,
So
it's so true.
so I just laid out a
Yeah,
model for you where my
yeah,
job as creative
yeah,
director looks like it's going to be fine,
yeah.
but I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's so true, so true.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I completely agree with everything you said. I think there's a lot of there's so much, so many theories, so many people skeptical about what it's going to do, what it's going to replace, how it's going to enhance. And yeah, I think everyone has their own opinions right now. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens with it. I think in recruitment, we're already seeing a number of, as I mentioned before, already seeing a number of AI tools that ultimately are making a lot of things easier and a lot more automated for us. Do I think that it will replace us as recruiters who ultimately are here to build human relationships with people? I don't think so. I think everyone in recruitment will probably say it's not going to. I think yes, it can help enhance sourcing and everything else that's involved in as it said it with you in design. I think recruitment's the same thing. You've got the
Mhm.
end parts of the full life cycle that could potentially be done or certainly enhanced by AI, but the relationship building part of recruitment I don't think can ever be yeah can be mirrored by
Yeah.
AI. Can't do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's we'll see. I think the next few years will be interesting for sure.
Yeah, one of the things I found the most fascinating about the whole AI thing is, I studied history amongst other things. I got a degree in history, and
Yeah,
I read a lot of philosophy and, sort of into that, the humanities. And
yeah,
what's fascinating to me about AI is the neural networks that we're using now have been theorized for over 50 years. It's just that we only now have the computing power to be able to pull them
yeah,
off at scale, right? But
yeah,
computer scientists and people working in the field have been thinking about this moment for half a century. And
yeah,
as such, there's enormous volumes of philosophy that are already looking at this stuff and sort of asking the question, what is it going to mean to be human when you see machines being able to do a lot of things that we think are
yeah,
instinctively human now? Now, the relationship piece we'll set aside for a second, but a lot of the things that we think are inherently human in the acts of creativity, machines kind of seem to be doing sort of
yeah,
okay in the same way that
yeah,
they, got machines have gotten pretty good at chess,
yeah,
and they're doing well at Go. So,
yeah,
we
yeah,
used to think that's what it
yeah,
meant to be a person.
yeah,
And so there's a lot
yeah,
of, earlier last year, I was reading some really fascinating books about this. There's one called God, Human, Animal, Machine. It was sort of the nature of intelligence and where do we ascribe intelligence? And she was
yeah,
sort of looking at the arc of history and how we used to ascribe intelligence only to like supernatural God and stuff like that. And then we began to think, no, humans are intelligent as well. And now we sort of think, oh, there's a certain type of animal intelligence. And it's like, well, why don't we think that machines are
yeah,
intelligent? It's just because we're intimidated by it, or
yeah,
whatever. So
yeah,
so philosophically, I find it just
yeah.
an absolutely fascinating moment.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely, definitely. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about. I know you said, as you said, Bob's theory about AI, and generally it's everyone doesn't think it's going to replace their job. It's always the theory always involves them keeping their jobs. But I think certainly what I've seen across the market with the layoffs happening, and obviously the sort of check back to reality as you mentioned. Seeing the sort of diminishing of the other functions within design. So the smaller areas within maybe perhaps content, UX research, where companies have perhaps opted or decided to build out dedicated functions to those areas. What I certainly have seen is a bit more of a shift towards trying to compensate with hiring a generalist product designer, for instance, who has experience in research, or someone who has experience in content, UX writing, whatever it might be. Do you think that there'll be more of a shift towards hiring more generalists again, or do you see the specialists still sticking around for the long run?
Look, I think there's going to be enormous variety based on the
Yeah,
company and what the scale of the company and stuff like that. There's just going to be pressure to reduce headcount,
yeah,
because people are expensive. That's
yeah,
the bottom line. And
yeah,
potentially, especially people in the Western world, North America, California, people are expensive.
yeah,
And so there's going to be pressure to reduce headcount. And when you're reducing headcount, you're managing a team and you've got 20 folks to say, like,
yeah,
where are you going to put your chips,
yeah,
and I don't know, it's likely you're going to put them in someone who can produce the design work
yeah,
rather than some of these other roles. As much as I think these roles are critical and important,
yeah,
I think it's just going to be harder to justify to people who aren't in the field what an actual researcher does, what an actual
yeah,
content person does, what an actual design ops person does, what a production designer does. Like
yeah,
those roles are, again, I think they're critical. I just look at sort of the capitalist reality of it all,
yeah,
and it will be increasingly hard to
yeah,
justify those specialized
yeah.
roles.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, and I think that comes back to what you mentioned, obviously, where Apple, I think, is the company that's viewed by everyone to be the most design, the most forward thinking when it comes to design thinking. But you said it's a mindset. It's not something you can just buy with hiring designers. It's something you have to
yeah.
install in absolutely everyone in the company. But yeah, do you think that the lack of that knowledge and understanding is working against a lot of the guys in those specialist roles at the moment? The lack of understanding, as you mentioned, how critical they can actually be.
Yeah, and look, I'll say, I think if researchers and content people aren't if there's not a big enough design team to justify have those as dedicated roles in a full-time thing, I think it opens up a lot of possibility for contracting, and consulting type relationships, like or where researchers working across multiple teams, for example. So
Yeah.
I think there will still be opportunities to be successful in those fields. It just might not look like full-time work the way it has in the past. So
Yeah.
I'll
Sure.
park that for a second. And then your second question was about is it hard to understand? Yeah, from the point of the view of a CEO or a development officer or head of engineering, like they don't know what all those roles do. They don't know how to understand that. They don't understand the design process. It's often, quite ambiguous and fuzzy. It is a profession. We don't do a great job of communicating out to others like what happens. It all seems like kind of a black box. I've certainly been guilty of this. I can't often articulate my internal process and where the ideas come from. I just know that they do it, and so
Yeah.
I think for the types of people that are in tech organizations and engineering leaders and frankly product managers, who they're all very logical, analytical thinkers, and design seems like a very fuzzy, ambiguous kind of
Yeah.
thing. Um, and so they don't so because they don't understand it, it's easy to, remove certain roles or certain
Yeah.
people or whatever. I mean,
Yeah.
again, at ThoughtSpot, we try to make it more visible. And this was a big cultural shift for me because at Apple, all your design work kind of happened behind closed doors by design. That's how Apple
Yeah.
functioned, at least at that point, and I haven't been at Apple for in almost 10 years now. So I don't know the Apple of today. I know the Apple of like 2012. And in 2012, you just stuck to your knitting and you were doing
Yeah.
what you were doing, and that was it. Um, so at ThoughtSpot, it was hard when I got there because I kind of tried to keep everything in wraps in the studio, and it took me a while, but I eventually realized, oh, this entire company doesn't really understand design. They don't understand how we're making decisions. They don't understand all the different things that we're looking at. They don't understand what we're doing. It just seems like this massive black box where we go away, and then after some period of time, something comes out, and everybody goes, "Well, okay, yeah, I guess that's cool." And so I realized we needed to design in public. And
Yeah.
for I think it's about 20 weeks, and then honestly, I just kind of ran out of steam doing it. But for a while, we basically made like a weekly TV show, again on Loom, where I would
Yeah.
talk a little bit at the beginning, and then I have two creative directors that I work with. Each one of them would actually show some of the work from their studio. Some of these videos I talked about earlier, where the designers are sending me Loom videos of the walkthroughs of their projects, we
Yeah.
would send those out. We'd make that part of this whole thing, and then we send out this 25-minute video, to the whole company, and people all across sales and any part of the company, they could kind of watch it and they could see what was happening inside the studio. And we would show them very formative work. I mean, some like hand sketches, preliminary block frame diagrams, 15 different approaches. Like we were showing them all the messy
Yeah.
middle. Um,
Yeah.
and look, it was super effective. It was a lot of additional work for me and some of my leaders, but it was really fun because I'd go to like sales conferences and people would come up and they would know who I was and they'd just start talking to me,
Yeah.
and they would talk about how much they really appreciate kind of seeing behind the scenes.
Yeah.
So again, I would, for the listeners that are running design teams, I'd encourage you to kind of think about the fact that if you're frustrated with your PM or your engineering counterparts or your exec team, a lot of it may just be they have no idea what you do,
Yeah.
like what you really do, like
Yeah.
what that messy middle really looks like, because it is
Yeah.
so foreign to pretty much every other function in a
Yeah.
company.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny you say that because your good friend Dane Howard on the last one mentioned something
Hmm.
similar about
Hmm.
I think he may have actually said you told him to do this, or I can't remember what he said, but he definitely mentioned you in something. But it was, yeah, it was he would love, to make a documentary, if you like, have a day to day, someone recording everything that they're doing in design to, yeah, to effectively be able to sell what they're doing and show everyone who they're dealing with, who they're struggling with, perhaps if there's friction between departments or whatever it might be, just to show them
Hmm.
exactly, what they're doing and why they're doing it. And yeah, I think there's always been a little bit of tension, sometimes a little bit of friction between departments. But as you said, it may just literally be that within design, the other guys just don't really know, exactly what
Yeah,
they're doing and why you're doing it.
right,
So
right.
yeah, but
Yeah, and
look,
look, I'll say that the tension between the three different disciplines, engineering, PM,
yeah,
and design, like I think of it kind of like the structure of the U.S. government, or many governments where
yeah,
there's an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a
yeah,
judicial branch. I sort of joke that like PMs are like the executive branch, right? They kind of set the agenda. They're the most visible piece.
Yeah.
They control a lot of what's going on, but they can only do certain things on their own. They actually need the other branches to help. Engineering's a little bit like the legislative branch. There's a bunch of them. They tend to fight a lot. There's a lot of committees and whatnot. And then design is a little bit like the judicial branch, like in the United States, sort of like the Supreme Court. We
Yeah.
wear a lot of black. We like to meet behind closed doors. We have our own special language.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about consistency and adherence to precedent. And nobody really knows what we do.
Yeah.
Um, and so, I think we all kind of have to lean into our roles, and we have to appreciate that there's something magical about the balance between those three functions. And we shouldn't expect the tension to go away. The tension is purposeful and useful. We just need to realize that everybody's playing their part. And PM is trying to get something out in a certain time
Yeah.
frame. Engineering's trying to put something out that's particularly stable. We're trying to put something out, that's particularly elegant or approachable or whatever, the
Yeah.
right thing for the users. And when the compromise that comes out of that can actually be wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah.
And where things get wrong is when one of those groups get completely squashed down and
Yeah.
overpowered by one of the other two. And
Yeah.
that's when things go awry. So you'll never get rid of the tension between the functions. The trick is, how do you manage the tension between the people?
Yeah.
And how
Yeah.
do you minimize that? Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just about creating effective collaboration. Everyone needs to be aiming or striving towards the same end goal. It's just how you get there and how you collaborate as functions, not
Mm-hmm.
working against each other, but working with each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I wanted to just very quickly, Bob. I know we've been talking for a little while, which has been a pleasure, I must add. But I just wanted to cover off the last topic we wanted to speak about was obviously you've been in the industry for over 3 decades now. Um, as you said at the start, people may question, why have you done it for so long? What's kept you motivated? Why haven't you, just retired and gone and lived in Florida or Miami or something by the beach? um, but yeah, what has been the key motivators for you, and why are you still doing it after such a long time?
Yeah, so I mentioned that I stepped back from tech for a while around 2016, and many people will remember there was a very important presidential election here in the United States in 2016, and there was a lot of sense that social media and technology had a big influence on it, and frankly, I didn't feel great about that. And
Yeah,
so
yeah,
I,
yeah,
when I had moved to Silicon Valley in 1990, there was still sort of a hippie ethos that ran through the whole place, and there was sort of a hope and an optimism, and people doing cool things on computers because they just like to watch the pixels dance. And I was sort of that type, right? Like I just fell
yeah,
in love with computing, and I still deeply, deeply love computing. It is, in fact, my medium as a creator,
yeah,
although it took me a while to figure that out. So anyway, since 2016, 2017, I'm taking some time off, and I'm driving up and down Highway 101, talking to a lot of different companies in Silicon Valley. And I started to listen to this podcast that was about the history of Silicon Valley. And it was a show. The show is called Raw Data, and it was their second season. And it starts with this episode called Monument to a Dead Child. That's about the founding of Stanford University.
yeah,
And they kind of go through the whole history of Silicon Valley. And in that, they mention a book called From Counterculture to Cyberculture, written by this guy named Fred Turner. And in the beginning of that book, Fred kind of has this great question, which is, why is it in the late 1960s that personal computing started in Silicon Valley, when at the time, it wasn't then Silicon Valley, started in Northern California,
yeah,
when at the time, all the tech companies in the United States were on the East Coast. So why did personal computing happen in
yeah,
Northern California? And the answer is, well, there was a very small group of people in and around Palo Alto, California, in and around Stanford, that included folks like Doug Engelbart and Stuart Brand and Alan Kay and Larry Tesler and others. And they saw software and computing in general as a new form of media on par with movies, music, and books. Whereas the reigning mindset on the East Coast was that computing was a tool. It was a tool of bureaucracy. It's how you process social security checks. It's
yeah,
how you ran the military. And when I heard that, I was like, oh yeah, like that's why I find computing so, like, what I love about computing is personal computing.
yeah,
I do sort of buy into the whole bicycle for your mind thing. And like when I got a Mac in 1984, and yesterday, we're recording this on January 25th. Yesterday, January 24th, was the 40th anniversary, of the Mac, 40th anniversary of the release of the Mac. Sorry.
yeah,
So, I think about the impact that product's had on my life and frankly, all of our lives. And I sort of have now come to think of software as media, and like this is just the medium that I'm working in, you know. And if I go back to my 20s, I experimented with being a musician, being a photographer, being a filmmaker, being a graphic
Yeah.
designer, and those I knew in my heart I was a maker, but I was hunting for my medium.
Yeah.
And eventually I found software, and software is the perfect medium for my rather unusual brain. And so when people ask me, you know, what keeps you going, it's really I don't know. It's like asking a novelist what keeps them going, you know, or asking
Yeah.
a film director, like, why, you know, Martin Scorsese, why are you going to make another movie? Why don't you just
Yeah.
retire? And Martin's like, because I make movies. Like, that's what I
Yeah.
do. And so I'm kind of that way with software. It's not a job. It's not a career. It's closer to anything. It's a calling. And one of the things that I've realized in the last few years, and I try to like really push on design leaders and designers in general, is that if you back up and you think about software as a medium, I think you'll quickly realize that software is the most important cultural artifact being produced today. There
Yeah.
is no doubt that the decisions we make in software and the software experiences we're creating have greater cultural influence than anything coming out of the music industry, the movie industry, or literature, right?
Yeah.
Like Facebook has had way more impact on the world than anything that's come out of Hollywood in decades.
Yeah, for sure.
and
Yeah, and
and so
there's some crap coming out of Hollywood right now as well.
yeah, yeah. And so once you start realizing that you're working in this medium that happens to be software, I think you can kind of reconceptualize what you're doing. And
Yeah.
maybe you can say, oh yeah, the fight is still hard, but the fight is worth having because there are billions of people on the other side of the glass whose lives are going to be affected by the things that you come up with.
Yeah.
And so in a very real sense, it's incredibly empowering. Like we are all incredibly privileged to get to work on products that are going to touch so many people. Um, but it also means it's hard, you know.
Yeah.
If it was easy, it would be because the stakes are a lot lower, you know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the stakes are high, you know. I mean,
Yeah.
me and some of your listeners have worked on products that are used by millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions
Yeah.
of people. You know, do
Yeah.
you think that's going to be easy?
Yeah.
No, of course
Yeah.
not. So,
Yeah. Exactly.
so
Yeah.
yeah, but it's worth it. So
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think the scope of your work, I think it just become because it's all digital, and obviously it's not a physical necessarily a physical thing. You're not seeing the millions of people that are using your your products. It just becomes like, you know, it becomes something you don't even become aware of probably half the time. You know,
yeah, I'm
just
glad you
yeah,
mentioned that because
yeah,
I think that's one of the real challenges of being
yeah,
in software. And I think it's a challenge for both sides there. I think it's a
yeah,
challenge for the creators and for the audience
yeah,
because we work in the most influential medium there is, yet it's unattributed. Like
yeah,
if I was to ask you who are the if you know some famous magazine's going to run a cover article about the world of UI design,
yeah.
I could ask you who's going to go on the cover, and you would have no idea, even though you work in the
Bob
industry.
Baxley.
That's probably not me. I mean, if you ask somebody,
Yeah,
they might say Johnny Ive, but Johnny's not a
yeah,
software designer, right?
yeah,
Like Johnny's a hardware designer. So
yeah,
it's like who come up with all this software stuff?
yeah,
And because it's unattributed, I think those of
yeah,
us on the creation side, it's hard for us to appreciate the impact that we're having on the audience
yeah,
because we never get to see them. I mean, I've worked on
yeah,
products that have been used by a billion people. I've never
yeah,
seen anybody ever
yeah,
use anything I've created in real time,
yeah,
right? And
yeah,
then the flip side, I think, is even more tragically true, which is the audience doesn't know who's producing this
yeah,
stuff.
yeah,
And so if when things don't work right, and they often don't work right, the
yeah,
audience doesn't know who to get mad at. It just
yeah,
feels like there's this faceless thing
yeah,
called Silicon Valley or tech
yeah.
that's churning out all this junk that they've got to